In this episode, we're going to continue our rediscovery of the music of Paul McCartney through the decades. Now, our previous episode, we started with the Beatles, and we kind of mirrored it on the Red album, which had music from 63 through 66. And in that time, Paul and the Beatles put out 7 albums. But now we're going to continue on with the second half of the 1960s, and we'll sort of mirror what became then the Blue Album, which was 67 through 69. Now, before anybody takes me to task, I know that the Blue Album is actually the music from 67 to 1970, but in this series, I'm breaking Paul's music down by decade. And we're actually not going to talk about the Red or the Blue albums because they weren't even released during this period. So you ready to find out what Paul was doing in the 60s? Well, let's drop the needle. Now, as I did in the last episode, I'm only going to be looking at really the Beatles songs where Paul sings lead or co-sings with one of the other guys in the group. There's a lot of material here to look at. And as I said before, I'm not downplaying the role of the other 3 Beatles. We're just concentrating on Paul's songs. Now, by this point in the Beatles' career, it was pretty easy to tell who had written the song. In the early days, John and Paul were writing together. But by now, they were starting to drift apart and write separately. And usually it was the person who sang lead who had written the song. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this mini-series talking about singles, because in most cases the singles appeared on some album. But at the start of 1967, John had written a song, and in fact, it was the first song to be recorded for what was going to be their next album. And it was about his memories of childhood in Liverpool, and he called it Strawberry Fields Forever. Now, this inspired Paul to sort of answer John with his own song about memories of his childhood in Liverpool, and Paul's song, vastly different, is called Penny Lane. Penny Lane tells the story of a banker, a barber, a nurse in a roundabout, and of course the street Penny Lane. And the Beatles actually recorded promotional films, little short clips, the first sort of music videos for both Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. Audiences really didn't know what to make of this groundbreaking music that was so different. And when they saw the films, the Beatles appeared different. Now, this single could only reach number 8 in the US, and amazingly, in the UK, it never even charted. In the spring of 1967, Paul on his own wrote a song called Love in the Open Air, which was part of what was going to be a soundtrack to a movie called The Family Way, starring Hayley Mills. Now, the music is credited to Paul McCartney. The orchestration is the George Martin Orchestra. Pretty lofty goal for Mr. McCartney, but actually, Paul had even weightier things on his mind. Paul's grander ideas started when he was flying on a plane with roadie Mal Evans, and they were having lunch, and Mal leaned over and said, "Can you pass the salt and pepper?" And Paul misheard it as Sergeant Pepper, and that got his mind spinning. And he came up with the idea that the Beatles could take on a persona of a totally different group. So in the summer of love of 1967, the Beatles changed musical history by releasing the amazing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was billed as a concept album. Now, when you really listen to it, yeah, it starts out that way and it ends that way, but it kind of meanders in the middle. But it really doesn't matter. It is an amazing album with some terrific songs on it. Paul sings lead on 5 tracks. The opener, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Getting Better, with John's little witty aside, it couldn't get much worse, Fixing a Hole, When I'm 64, and Lovely Rita. Then Paul sings with John on She's Leaving Home, A Day in the Life, and with John, George, and Ringo on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band Reprise. The album has sold over 32 million copies worldwide, making it one of the highest-selling albums of all time. Many people have also pointed out that with this album, Paul really exerts his creative control over the band. One of my favorite memories of this period of time is walking through Old Town in Chicago and hearing this record through the open windows of every apartment, flat, and hippie store in the area. Now, they weren't always in sync, naturally, but it was an amazing experience. Sgt. Pepper was taking over at least Chicago and then the world. After the grand reception to Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles were at the height of their popularity and influence. And, as usual, they seized the moment. In June of 1967, they took part in the Our World Global TV special. 4 satellites were used to beam this television signal live around the world. The program was broadcast to 24 countries, and the audience is estimated to be between 400 and 700 million people. Because of all the different countries this was being broadcast to, the program was broadcast in black and white. The Beatles were asked to come up with a positive song with a message that could be understood by everyone, a song using simple English. The song they chose was All You Need Is Love, and it was written by John and Paul. The segment of the Beatles was colorized later for their anthology project. Paul has another grand idea. He says to them, "Hey lads, let's make a film. How hard can it be?" And so in December of 1967, they release a film with a soundtrack, of course, which is called Magical Mystery Tour, and it is the only film to be directed by the Beatles. The soundtrack was released as a double EP in the UK and an album in the US. On this outing, besides being Paul's loose idea for the film, he sings lead on the title track, Magical Mystery Tour, Your Mother Should Know, and Fool on the Hill. The film aired in the UK on Boxing Day, and although the film was shot in color, the BBC aired it in black and white, I guess because a number of British people did not have color televisions at the time. Anyway, the program was aired in black and white, and audiences did not get it. And for the first time, really, in their career, the Beatles got a slew of negative criticism. The film was decidedly a flop. I remember being in college, and on Friday and Saturday nights, the local theater, would do midnight screenings, and it'd always be some sort of cult film or something. And that's where I first saw Magical Mystery Tour. It was a mind-blowing experience, even if it's not a very good film. 1968 starts with the Beatles recording a single, which is called Lady Madonna. And Paul actually plays this song even today in his live sets. He says he was inspired by Fats Domino, and he wanted kind of a boogie-woogie feel to the piano. It tells the story of a working woman and all the troubles she has each day of the week as she goes through the week. Except somehow, Paul forgot Saturday, and he didn't realize it until years later. The single reached #1 in the UK and #2 in the US. Then the Beatles decide to trek off to India to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi. And while they are there, John and Paul write a lot of songs. That will appear on their next album. In November of 1968, a lot of those songs written in India appear on their next album, which is a double album containing 30 songs, simply called The Beatles, but more commonly referred to as the White Album, because the cover is just plain white with the words The Beatles on it and a serial number stamped on it. A clear change from their really wild cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This album is all over the place with many types of different musical genres being represented. And in fact, you can kind of sense the Beatles are fracturing a little bit, because as they record this, they're off in separate studios, each recording their own song, and many times all the members of the group are not even recording together. Paul sings lead on 11 tracks. The Beach Boy parody with Back in the USSR. One of the songs that the other members have said they really hated recording, Obla Di Obla Da. Wild Honey Pie. Martha My Dear, about his sheepdog. Blackbird, that great civil rights protest song. Rocky Raccoon, which actually is one of my favorites. The Goofy, Why Don't We Do It in the Road? I Will, Mother Nature's Son, Helter Skelter, which Paul says was written because he was convinced they could write a louder song than The Who, and Honey Pie. And with John, he sings Birthday and Cry Baby Cry. Now it's time for another film, but by this point, the Beatles couldn't be bothered. So the studio decides, well, let's make it an animated film. And boy, do they ever. They create the psychedelic animated film called Yellow Submarine, which turned out to be so good that after the Beatles saw it, they decided they'd make a cameo at the closing of the film. On the soundtrack album, Paul sings with John on 2 tracks, All Together Now, which they perform in the movie, and then my favorite, which is Hey Bulldog, where John and Paul end up sounding and barking like dogs at the end of the recording. Now, in September of 1969, the Beatles release their last album that they recorded together. It's called Abbey Road. But after Abbey Road was released, then they release another album, which was actually recorded before Abbey Road. So people kind of get confused as to which was the last album. But the last album they actually recorded together was called Abbey Road. Paul sings lead on 8 of the 17 tracks. Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which the rest of the group said they hated. Oh Darlin', a great song that John Lennon says he wishes he would have sang. You Never Give Me Your Money, which is Paul's put-down of their manager at the time, Alan Klein. She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, which was actually the story of a groupie who crawled in Paul's bathroom window at his place in London, not far from Abbey Road. Golden Slumbers, The End, and that weird little ditty that's stuck at the end, Her Majesty. He sings with Lennon and Harrison on the beautiful Because and Sun King, and Ringo joins the other 3 on Carry That Weight. Although there are lots of great songs on this album, it's kind of the medley at the end of side 2 that everyone remembers, where they took snippets of songs and linked them all together. It really is a joyous occasion, and if it had to be the last album the Beatles ever made, they went out smiling. That would all change in 1970. And with that, we reach the end of Paul McCartney's recordings for the 1960s. Not bad for 6 years of work. 12 albums with the Beatles, 3 notable singles, and 1 solo soundtrack. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. Paul has certainly generated a lot of music, and it's in his DNA, and I can't see him ever stopping. But now we're going to move to the next decade, the 1970s, and it's kind of a rough time for Paul. He's got to sort of reinvent himself. But you know, he does, and he does with great success. You know, they always say, when one door closes, another one opens. And when it does, you can bet Paul McCartney's going to walk through it. So that's the 60s. The next episode will turn to the 70s. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.